All right. Well, I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. And for those of you that are getting on right at noon, thank you. We'll go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Blair McGarry. I am the Executive Director for the Summit Chamber of Commerce. And I am thrilled to be having this conversation with you all today. Thank you all so much for joining us. We know that childcare is such an important topic. And again, I just could not be more thrilled to talk about childcare, the Summit County workforce, and the economy, as we know that they do all intertwine and connect. Joining me today, I have Nicole Reel with Epic, Executives Partnering to Invest in Children, as well as Catherine Schaff with Early Childhood Options. We know that childcare has long been an issue in our community and one that has really just been highlighted through the pandemic, as the effects have really just been absolutely devastating on our workforce, going through quarantines and remote learning, school closures. There's been a lot of obstacles that our workforce has had to overcome, and childcare has certainly been one of those barriers. But we know here in Summit County that it's long been an issue for us. We've been facing these challenges pre-pandemic, but we live in a community that recognizes that and recognizes the economic impacts that childcare does have on our community. And so we've invested in early childhood education as a community through voter approved funding for affordable childcare services. And while that has helped, we know that there is still a lack of consistent affordable childcare in our community. COVID has only heightened this, and we see people dropping out of the workforce as a result of the lack of consistent childcare. Here in Summit County, we've seen a 5% decline in early childhood education enrollment, a 3% decline in early childhood education workforce, and 25% of families report inadequate care for children 5 and under. That's extremely alarming for us when we know that we have a workforce that really depends on consistent childcare, and that's our employment base is really affected by that childcare. So what can we do about this? Catherine and Nicole are here to share some ideas and really allow us to think about childcare in a different way. Really, again, excited to have this conversation with you all. So just really quickly, a couple of housekeeping items. We will have time at the end for a Q&A session. So if you want to put your questions into the chat, I look forward to a pretty great conversation after these ladies present to us. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Nicole and let her take it from there.
Thank you so much, Blair. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Reel. I'm President and CEO of Executives Partnering to Invest in Children, otherwise known as EPIC. A little bit of background on our organization. EPIC is an 11-year-old nonprofit organization here in Colorado. Our work really spans statewide, and we were founded by a group of business executives and leaders across Colorado who felt like there really needed to be an organization who could represent the business community's voice when it came to supporting and advancing early childhood priorities for our state, both for the benefit of our current workforce as well as the benefit of our future workforce. So we work very diligently on really both of those sides. We advance policies, help build infrastructure, and really try to move this forward as a priority for our state as a whole. I have been with EPIC since September of 2019. I'm very proud to say I'm a Colorado native and have contributed to the Summit County economy pretty much my whole life. And I actually started my career at an on-site childcare facility for storage tech employees up in the Boulder County area early on. It was about 20 years ago. So, it's been a while, and I've had the opportunity to work in the private sector for one of the nation's largest home builders. I worked in the financial services division for them for a number of years, and then eventually made my way back to early childhood and really found a love with early childhood policy and nonprofit management. So for me, this job with EPIC is really my dream job and the perfect mix of working with the business world and early childhood together. So I am going to share my screen and go through some slides here. All right. Awesome. Well, today, of course, we're going to talk about childcare, the workforce, and our economy. And so I'm just going to start by talking about our future workforce. So this is a Colorado baby. This is actually my daughter, who's now in first grade and is 7 years old. So I am a working mother and have myself experienced the many ups and downs and challenges of this pandemic and everything that's come with, remote learning and all sorts of things happening on a weekly basis. And I've had the benefit of being able to work from home. And I can't imagine how difficult it's been for families who don't have that opportunity, or even single parents as well. But mostly, I wanted to start out with talking about the fact that our economic development really begins with early childhood development. That quality early childhood experiences are really critical to shaping a human's trajectory and future educational and career success down the road. And we know that early childhood has one of the best returns on investments that we can make when it comes to investing our dollars publicly. So children who have quality early learning and early childhood experiences have an increase in graduation levels. They show greater propensity to achieve self-sufficiency and economic mobility down the road, and also greater career success. And we know this is important because we want to make sure that Colorado maintains the ability to compete as a state in our global and national economy, and that we want to retain and attract a fantastic workforce here in Colorado, and also build a great workforce here in Colorado. Alternatively, we also know that quality early childhood experiences also decrease a reliance on public assistance programs down the road, as well as things like incarceration. So a child's brain is developing at roughly 1 million neural connections every second when they're in the first 5 years of life. And we know that the vast majority of brain development is happening in those first 5 years of life as well. So as a society, we know based on scientific research and studies that the greatest opportunity to impact a child's life and trajectory is in those early years of life. And whatever we can do to support that is what we want to do here through EPIC and through our presentations today. Thinking about our current workforce, and this data is specific to Summit County. Summit County actually has a higher workforce participation than most counties around the state of Colorado and most areas across the country. And I don't think that comes as a surprise to you. We all know that the cost of living is significantly higher. And so in most cases, you really do need all adults in a household working and participating in the workforce in Summit County. So these are pre-pandemic numbers. So I want to put a disclaimer there because we know that the pandemic has changed a lot of things. And some of this data has changed, as we know, unfortunately, with regards to things like unemployment. But previous to the pandemic, about 77% of families had all working families in the household participating in the workforce, meaning that they would also then need to find some sort of childcare for those children that they have in their homes as well. Over 50% of your workforce in Summit County is also in the tourism, recreation, and construction industry. So that's important to note because we know that typically those are industries where individuals are oftentimes in positions or roles where they do need to report to a physical office location or facility and maybe don't have the opportunity to work remotely or work from home. Summit County has about 9,700 households and 1,300 children under age 5. And before the pandemic, only had about 830 licensed childcare slots. So if we look at the workforce participation rates and the number of children in Summit County, it's over 1,000 children that we believe would need to have access to some form of childcare on a regular basis. And of course, we know that the childcare slots available are really not enough to meet that demand, and most especially when it comes to infant and toddler care. It's also important to note that nationally, Colorado is ranked about 8th in terms of the highest cost of childcare in our country. So about over $15,000 a year on average for the cost of one infant in full-time childcare. And for a family with 2 children, with one of those being an infant, it would be over $27,000 a year. So a tremendous cost with childcare, and I can certainly attest to that cost as a parent who paid for a child to go through childcare for the first 5 years of her life. And then moving on to economic impact, what do we know about the impact of the shortage of childcare on our economy here in Colorado and also in Summit County? So I want to note that these numbers are from a study that was conducted by the Council for a Strong America, and that the Summit County numbers that I'm noting here are essentially projections based on the GDP numbers for the state of Colorado versus Summit County. So maybe not perfectly accurate, but the study itself did not break numbers down by county areas because they did not find a significant difference across counties in the study. And so for that reason, wanted to point out where these numbers are coming from and make sure that that was noted. But overall, the study basically came to the conclusion that Colorado sees $2.2 billion in lost earnings, productivity, and revenue due to the infant and toddler childcare shortage that we have across our state. Again, we know that preschool care is much more available and predominant for families, but infant and toddler childcare is really where families really do struggle quite a bit in terms of both finding childcare and affording childcare. And for Summit County, that equates to about $13.6 million in lost earnings and productivity and revenue. In addition, they also provided the statistic that about $680 million is lost by employers directly in Colorado as a result of this issue. And for Summit County, again, that would project out to roughly $4.2 million for employers in Summit County. And in this study, I also wanted to note that about 79% of parents who responded to the study, it was a very large group of families who responded, reported that they had adverse impacts on their efforts or their commitments at work due to childcare problems that they had. And I'm sure all of us at one point in time have either experienced this personally, or we know someone who has, or we've had an employee or a direct report who's had challenges with this. But it really is quite a widespread challenge for families and something that is having a very direct impact, both on the bottom line for employers and companies, but also in terms of our larger economy here in Colorado. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Catherine, who is going to tell you a little bit more about the effects of the pandemic in Summit County and what we've seen over the past year as this pandemic has unfolded and really impacted families in the community there.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for this opportunity to present to you today. We're really excited about this topic and bringing light to our current childcare system in Summit County. I'm going to share my screen and present my slides. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID for our community to the working families, childcare businesses, and early childhood educators. Some of the impacts that I'd like to highlight today for working families is talking about with our COVID-19 pandemic, we've dealt, working families have dealt with some outbreak and quarantine closures. Those closures can last up to 14 days at the child care centers across the county. These teachers in the classrooms are essential workers. And, sometimes if they're also, working in the child care facility, they cannot report to work, making it difficult to operate classrooms. And then also working from home for families with young children can present its own challenges every day. You think of why we utilize childcare is because, we want to foster their development and make sure that these babies are developing along the ways that we want them to. So if you're caring for your child, getting your work done isn't necessarily go hand in hand. Another highlight is that the tuition bill is another bill that just has to be paid every month. It's typical to our cell phone bill and our mortgage. It continues to come. Nicole highlighted some tuition rates for across the state. And I think in Summit County, we're pretty similar, a little bit higher than the state average. I wrote out the average care for infant toddler care being $1,600 a month for 5 days a week, and preschool tuition being about $1,440 a month. I wanted to highlight some of the tuition supports that we've offered in our community because of the high cost of quality care. About 35% of our families with children ages 0 to 5 are receiving tuition supports. Town of Breck currently offers a tuition scholarship program, and they're serving around 100 children on average. Our Summit Pre-K tuition from Summit County Strong Futures Initiative currently serves 137 children. Head Start and Early Head Start with 60, CCAP, which is state-run childcare, about 52 children. And then Colorado Preschool Program, we serve about 90 children with those. So there's still a lot of families that are paying full price for these childcare services. We've also been able to introduce some emergency funding to support families that have been impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to provide this support to families. So far in the last 2 weeks, I've spoken with 28 families from across the county that will be supporting in helping their tuition bill due to closures or COVID-19 employment impacts. Some impacts for early child care and education on businesses. For our childcare businesses, majority of these are nonprofits. They've seen an increased cost of operating business due to closures, quarantines, and additional mandated paid time off, and increased pandemic supplies. Enrollment has decreased along all 14 sites in early spring 2020 when we saw all of our closures. We, as an agency, Early Childhood Options, really fostered supporting all of our childcare facilities in getting back up in June and provided lots of support for these new standards from CDC and CDPHE guidelines that were asked of them. As of today, 11 sites are back to full capacity. And, you know, I would say this number of 11 sites, we're close to 14, but, you know, we struggle with the staff availability, and that being, you know, the workforce, finding teachers to come to school due to closures or due to quarantines that they're under. And then also, you know, our workforce is really hard to fill some shoes in the classrooms. We also see a lot of large wait lists are remaining from the north to the south of the county. These numbers, I feel like, change ever so quickly, and are dependent on you know, where the families live or work in our community. In 2020, childcare programs received support from federal, state, and local entities. Head Start, Office of Early Childhood Relief Grants, our Right Start and Strong Futures funding from Summit County Government, Summit Foundation, BGV, and Slipher, Smith, and Frimpton. All the funds are designed to help offset the cost of operating in a pandemic, as well as support the quality and affordability of childcare for parents. Some of the impacts to highlight on early childhood educators. I wanted to point out the equity to be high quality teachers that almost immediately as you get hired at a childcare facility, training and coursework required to become early child care teacher is imminent. As soon as you sign up to come to work the next day, most likely your director at your site will be asking you to take college level coursework to become qualified teacher in the classroom. We also ask a lot of curriculum prep and assessments with little to no planning time for these teachers. Thankfully, we have supports from CMC and Right Start that are able to provide the scholarships to help with the cost of tuition the employer is asking them to complete. Early childhood education teachers are essential workers with long hours and increased cleaning and safety precautions to care for children during the pandemic and public health requirements. This has also increased the cost of operating for our sites to provide those materials. And I also wanted to highlight that it extends the workday with increased cleaning procedures before and after, and all throughout the day as those children move around the classroom. Pay wages average about $15 an hour for teachers and $23 an hour for admin. Both the town of Breckenridge and Frisco support teacher wages. Also, through county-funded Right Start programming, we use retention tools such as salary supplements based on credentials for teachers and shared services to help support health insurance and retirement benefits to help professionalize the workforce. Also, during the pandemic, we worked with Building Hope to provide mental health supports for the teachers as they got back into the classroom, and then work through their challenges of their new daily routines. So I think, we've done a lot in helping them, but I still feel we've got a long way to go. I'll stop sharing and we'll get back. Great, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So this is Nicole again. I know that, that's a lot of data and a lot of information. And oftentimes, once we share a lot of this information, of course, the next step in everyone's minds is, so what do we do about it? And what are the solutions here? So that's what we're going to continue on here with the slide deck and really talk through. Oops, there we go. Okay, so thinking about what employers can do specifically in their local community, I first off want to say, Epic works with a wide variety of business leaders and employers here in Colorado, and from small businesses to very, very, very large corporations. And the capability that business leaders and businesses themselves have right now varies widely. We know that this pandemic especially has had really significant impacts on a lot of industries, especially industries like tourism and recreation and construction, and a lot of the industries that are very strong in Summit County. And so for a lot of business leaders, we know that it may not be a time where a business can invest in childcare solutions, for example, right now. Maybe this is something that from an investment perspective, you think about down the road, but there are some easy internal, what I would call quick wins that we can talk about with regards to how employers can really make sure they're doing their best to support their employees and retaining them and making sure it's a supportive environment. So I think this is something that we've all heard about, and know, of course, this isn't possible in all industries either, but whenever possible, of course, schedule flexibility and remote working is definitely helpful for many families right now, especially those who are having childcare challenges, who are dealing with remote learning or quarantines, or, the list goes on of all of these challenges for families. Moreover, it's really important to also make sure that your company, no matter how big or small it is really having open conversations and establishing a culture that normalizes support for working families. And, I think one of the good examples of that is, before the pandemic, it may have been considered a little bit taboo for an employee to have to bring a child into the office with them. And sometimes that's not appropriate, or even have them in the background on Zoom. And now we've seen, many business leaders really trying to normalize that and say, oh yeah, have your kids come in and say hi, or, we've all seen people's, dogs or whatever on Zoom. But really encouraging managers within the organization and everyone in the organization to really accept and normalize that culture of supporting working families. Making sure that if there are special accommodations provided for working families, like more flexibility or remote work arrangements, that it's really clear to both them and their supervisors or managers how that's going to be handled when it comes to things like performance reviews, so that people don't have, concerns about, they said I could be flexible in my schedule, but I feel like this might show up on my performance review, 6 months down the road, because is it really okay? And so those kinds of questions do exist in employees' minds. And I think it's really important to make sure that, you know, you're really naming those concerns as a business leader or as an employer in an organization, and making sure those types of protocols and really processes are in place to support that. Predictability and consistent communications. You know, I can't tell you enough how much parents rely on kind of knowing, as you know, as much as possible, what's coming down the pike and what they need to plan for, especially if they are juggling childcare arrangements or depending on family or neighbors or other people, to really help out with that. So as much as you can, you know, really providing predictability in, you know, times that reoccurring meetings will happen, or if there are expectations of them, you know, reporting to a certain location or showing up for meetings or whatever it may be that their job requires, giving as much lead time and notice as possible. And also really seeking employee feedback and ideas around this topic. You know, the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation just did a huge study this year around childcare challenges for the workforce. And when they did a direct employer survey, about 78% of employers said that they knew childcare was a challenge for their employees. But only 13% of employers actually reported asking their employees or doing any sort of formal feedback mechanism to really get a good grasp on what those challenges are and what the potential solutions could be. So consider doing something more formal like that and asking employees directly, rather than having it be something that kind of that tends to come through managers or, you know, just through, you know, people talking to one another in an organization. You know, what are the really big issues here? So secondly, companies can look at internal investments as a solution. And again, you know, there is a return on investment here when it comes to attracting and retaining your workforce and having higher productivity and things like that as well. Of course, paid family leave is a big one, and we know that the state of Colorado as a whole is going to be implementing a whole new paid family leave program over the next couple of years here. But if your company's in a position to consider investments, these are kind of your list of items that you may want to look at. Backup care services for families who maybe need temporary access to childcare or, you know, have things that come up. Childcare subsidies for employees, either direct stipends or via community sites. So one thing I wanted to note as well is that when we talked about the industries represented in Summit County, with, you know, a large portion of your workforce being in tourism and recreation and construction, those are industries that oftentimes do require evening and weekend hours. And, you know, I don't think anyone, this is a mystery to anyone, but there's definitely a lack of childcare when it comes to meeting those types of hourly needs that families have. Evening and weekend care is certainly something families have a need for and oftentimes can't find through the traditional licensed childcare providers. And so providing those subsidies for employees, or even looking at ways to create access to subsidies in community sites, and perhaps even exploring ideas around extended hours or weekend hours could be a really good solution for employers in Summit County. And then for some, and this is, you know, not always the case, certainly, there are some employers who look at on-site childcare as a solution. They have a large enough workforce, all reporting to one location primarily, where they could support something like that. I would say that tends to be more likely when you have these really large employer campuses or really large, you know, campuses with multiple employers together. But it's still a possibility to either have one company that creates on-site childcare, or like some companies are exploring now in Colorado, actually creating more of a co-op model where multiple companies come together to create a campus childcare solution that all of their employees can tap into. And lastly, community investments and advocacy. So I will note, I worked for an early childhood council before I took my role with EPIC, and Summit County is so lucky to have a fantastic early childhood council, early childhood options. So Lucinda and Catherine and the team over there are all really fantastic. And in many cases, the local early childhood council partners are doing a great deal of advocacy work and systems work to really make this better for the community. So I would say, you know, working with the local early childhood council to really address local barriers to entry for childcare businesses and professionals, And this could be sitting down and talking to people, which I know they've already done, about, what needs to happen for you to be able to open a childcare business. What needs to happen to make sure you can be sustainable? If it's someone who individually wants to open childcare in their home, what does that look like? And are there any barriers to address there? Secondly, Colorado is getting ready to design a universal preschool program as a result of Proposition EE passing on the November ballot. And there's a huge amount of advocacy that the business community can do here to make sure that Proposition EE and universal preschool across the state of Colorado is implemented in a way so that it can reach every community across our state, and it can support working families, and they can access those preschool resources at a community program that works for the needs of their family and their child. And that's certainly something that EPIC's been very involved in at the state level, but I know that early childhood councils are also going to be involved in that conversation. And we really encourage the business community to also, leverage their voices to advocate for this as well. And then lastly, and I think Blair's going to talk about this a little bit, but I think there are great community solutions that could be looked at to address larger capacity and infrastructure needs in local communities. Again, we know that Summit County has done some fantastic work when it comes to supporting early childhood education and access to childcare for the workforce. But it's still not enough, and there's still more that's needed. So, I know that Smith Ranch Development has been looking at potentially including childcare as a resource and a solution there. And so I think that could be a really great opportunity, again, for employers and business leaders, the chamber, the Early Childhood Council to come together and look at ways that, that can really meet the needs of the community with regards to childcare and early education resources. And lastly, we'll make sure we send these resources out to everyone who attended this call. But EPIC does have an employer toolkit on our website, so you're welcome to access that. And of course, our EPIC members, who are really business leaders from across the state, also have access to really customized technical assistance and consulting if they want to implement solutions within their own organizations. And then I also wanted to note that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation just yesterday sent out an executive briefing, which is called Essential Care for Essential Workers. And it is really a roadmap, very similar to what we just went through, around how employers of essential workers and really focusing on a lot of those service industries can implement solutions, and is very specific around what that looks like as well. So lots of great resources around that. I am going to now turn it over to Blair so we can answer some questions and talk about what's next.
I think I'd have mute figured out by now. But yeah, that is really, it's just fascinating information. And, the statistics and the numbers are a little daunting and, not too exciting. And so when we talk about what our options are moving forward and how can we make this better for our community, I'm extremely interested in this co-op model. And one of the questions that we have here is, are the models that you know of in Colorado are there models that you know of in Colorado or the region where a group of businesses or childcare co-op is successfully operating?
So I can speak to that a little bit, and then, Catherine, feel free to jump in after me as well. So there are collaboratives like that operating in other states, but as far as a true co-op, I'm not aware of any that are solely employer driven in Colorado yet. That said, I will say the Downtown Denver Partnership is actually another group that's looking at this model, because they have a real lack of access to childcare in the downtown Denver area, which of course right now is pretty empty. But we'll get busier again right after this pandemic. And so, I think as we've talked to a lot of business leaders around Colorado and an on-site childcare comes up, there's a couple of things that typically come up as concerns, right? Number one is risk. How much risk is my business taking on with childcare? And the second is cost. How much is this going to cost me? And I think what we also find is for small to mid-market businesses, that's a really big investment to make. And there's typically a lot of concern about opening an entire childcare facility and really having that as an investment that your company is solely responsible for. So I think, what's been nice is the co-op model offers an opportunity for these small to mid-market range businesses to come together and say, yes, we have a need for childcare. Maybe one business, they have a strong need for childcare evenings and weekends, and the other one might be more of a Monday to Friday model. But they could all come together, and the governance structure that I think that's been explored is creating a nonprofit co-op so that each of those organizations actually has essentially a governance seat or, way to actually play in that governance structure. But the co-op itself can then operate it and take on some of that risk and liability piece. And then the co-op itself can either, can contract, for example, with a local operator. In many cases, early childhood councils have really great relationships with a number of local operators who understand the community, and they understand how to operate high quality early childcare and education. And they come in and do that for a co-op, for a group of businesses. And so I think that's really the unique opportunity, is to think about, number one, who are those potential employers and businesses who are interested in providing some access to childcare, but want to really help mitigate that cost and that risk associated with it. And then, put together that co-op model. And, of course, there's a lot of semantics to figure out around, how many slots does each company pay for, and how does that capital build out happen. But one thing I wanted to note as well is that we have been working very closely with the governor's office this year, and the governor himself is very interested in how Colorado as a whole can help bring employers into this picture and really support their role in increasing access to early care and education, especially for rebuilding our economy and rebuilding our workforce after COVID. We've all heard about the she session probably, and the fact that working women with children, and most especially women of color, have really taken the brunt of this pandemic from an unemployment perspective, and want to make sure they can get back into the workforce as we start to recover from this pandemic. So the governor's office currently actually has a supplemental budget request that they have submitted to the Joint Budget Committee at the legislature for the 2021-2022 budget, which would be a $5 million employer-sponsored childcare grant program. So for employers who want to come together, either just themselves or with other employers, and think about potential childcare solutions, there would be grants available to actually implement those projects and help with some of the capital build out expenses on the front end.
That's great. Thank you, Nicole. Catherine, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I just want to continue saying, in Summit County, I think we've been really innovative in our approach to early childhood education. And, our council has been super supportive in early childhood options. I've been at the agency now for 5+ years, working through our, tax initiatives. We've done a really great job at supporting, but as we keep saying, there's still more work to do. And I think this idea of the co-op could be innovative for us in our approach to early childhood education and care. So just exploring that some more, and excited that the governor is on board with this as well and putting funding towards it. So, if anything out of this conversation that we're having today sparks some interest in people to think of some innovative approaches that we can take on in our community.
Thank you for that. And I think that you guys touched on some really important points that we're going to see post-pandemic. And part of that really here in Summit County is rebuilding our workforce. We know that 20 to 25% of our workforce is already left. And if we, continue down our road, we could see more. So attracting and retaining the workforce is going to be very important as we move into the future. And providing, benefits like childcare is huge. We know that some of the larger businesses are investing in this. Catherine, you pointed that out on one of your slides. But what about the smaller guys? The people that have, say, we always joke here in Summit County that a small business is really like, 1 or 2 people, not 500 people or less. So what about those smaller guys? What are the opportunities out there? I think about, the potential of a daycare or a preschool coming on board down in the Smith Ranch neighborhood, a partnership between the county and the town of Silverthorne. How can these small businesses come to the table and have that conversation with their government leaders, if that makes sense?
So, I think people tend to think of these investments as kind of an all or nothing scenario. And I think it's important to point out that even if a business at this point can come to the table and say, hey, like, we can't pay for the full cost of childcare for our employees, but we're willing to work with a local community childcare facility and partner to pay for, maybe a quarter of that, right? Or whatever it might be. Every little bit is going to help. And, like you mentioned, like, we know that to retain the workforce, people want to know that they can live there and they can afford to live there, that they can find childcare, they can find a job, right? They can get to their job with transportation. And so those are all going to be big pieces. But if you have someone considering a position and you're able to say, hey, like, we've partnered with a local early childhood program, we have slots set aside, and we're willing to pay for X percentage of the cost of childcare, that's still a huge plus for a lot of families and can still offset other expenses that we know that they're going to have. On the flip side, having private sector investment and having employers and businesses involved to support access to childcare also helps our early education businesses, right? Those businesses that are actually providing the childcare themselves. That is a very difficult business model to operate. And when you're in areas like Summit County, where real estate is just off the charts in terms of cost, it's even harder to operate. And I know that Early Childhood Options has figured that point out, because I think they've paid off some mortgages for childcare businesses and facilities in that area, because it's almost cost prohibitive at that point to operate a facility. But if you as a childcare business owner also have the financial stability of knowing you're working with various employers in the area and can count on, a certain amount of slots that are being, paid for or at least subsidized by an employer, that's also really going to help their business.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So we know from Catherine's slides that it looks like about 35% of families here in Summit County are being subsidized in some form or fashion. We also know that that's not necessarily a sustainable model. What are the things that we as business owners can put in place to kind of help backfill and create a way to lessen those subsidies, if you will? Loaded question.
Catherine, do you want to start with that one?
That is loaded. Well, because I work so closely with, giving out those subsidies for the Summit Pre-K. So my mind is always in that route. So Blair, whenever we've had these conversations together, you always stump me on this one, because it's a tough question to answer for me, I guess, because I'm in my silo over here.
Well, and I'll just add to that, Mark from the Northwest Colorado workforce area, he put into the chat to the panelists, and it's a great point. Summit County also has average weekly wages that lag significantly behind the state average. We know that. We never recovered really from the recession, the 2009 recession. These numbers have been inflated due to the pandemic, as more low-wage workers are no longer counted in weekly wage numbers. Summit County has one of the highest cost of living in the state, but ranks 21st among counties in average weekly wage. Childcare workers make among the lowest wages in Summit, but the local wage base cannot support the higher costs. So kind of to speak to your point, Nicole. So I thought it was really great how the town of Breckenridge and the town of Frisco, you mentioned that they are supporting those teacher wages. I'd love to learn more about what that looks like.
The town of Breckenridge has their program called Invest in Teachers, which, depending on the teacher's credential and their hours that they work at their site, they are stipend in amount to be dispersed to their teachers and admin staff. So they work closely, I say they, the providers, directors of those childcare sites in Breckenridge being Little Red Schoolhouse, Timberline Learning Center, Carriage House, and Breck Montessori. I would call them 3 large sites, and then Breck Montessori is a 1 classroom school. So I call that a smaller site. But they work closely with Corey at the town of Breck and provide data information to them to make sure that they're adhering to the program guidelines for that invest in teachers. And then that's an add line on their payroll to an additional amount per hour for that teacher. And I believe it's similar for the town of Frisco, and that is a partnership between Summit County Preschool, the 1 preschool in Frisco, and then the town of Frisco. And they supplement their wages pretty similarly.
Here's a question, a great one. If you had a magic wand, what 2 or 3 things would you make happen to help us solve this challenge long term?
Well, Catherine probably has different ones than I. So, I will add that in talking about the childcare business model in general, typically at least 70% of their operating expenses are associated with staff and labor expense, right? Which is good. We want to make sure we have highly trained, sufficient staff to support children's development at these facilities. But of course, it's a lot of labor expense. But right behind that expense is the cost of facilities and real estate, and really a lot of those ongoing capital expenses. And so one of the things that EPIC has been looking into from a statewide perspective is looking at ways that we can help reduce those long-term operating expenses around facilities and real estate and taxes and things like that. And so I think one of the things for communities to take a very close look at is whether there could be, for example, tax exemptions for childcare centers and family childcare homes, just like we have tax exemptions for K-12 schools across the state of Colorado, because they are considered a public good. They are considered part of our core infrastructure to our economy. And I would argue that childcare is just as much of essential infrastructure to our economy as roads and bridges and communication networks. And so, it's important to think about, what are those additional operating expenses that we could take away for those childcare businesses to also help them reduce costs for families, pay their staff more, and make sure that they can continue operating in that local economy. So things like, providing free or very low cost real estate, which I'm fairly certain in areas like Summit County and Eagle County is pretty much something is a must-have to operate childcare, but also looking at things like, the ongoing business personal property tax or commercial property taxes that come with facilities like that as well. I think those can be really big solutions to look at.
I think for us, thanks, Nicole, we have done a lot of work with the building expenses for childcare facilities. I think expanding some more capacity, I think a lot of us are really anxious to hear more about the Smith Ranch property and childcare facility going there. I would also highlight, we do a lot of work with blending and braiding our funding resources that we have. I think, I think we can do better. And, what ways can we expand our dollars and blend and braid a little bit better to take the cost burden off of the parents for their tuition enrollment? If it's doing, Town of Breck does some really great work. Town of Frisco does some really great work. The county does great work across the whole community. What ways can we all work together so we can trickle it down and make sure that parents are paying a lower cost? Is that a tuition assistance program for the whole community? We're really looking at what Nicole highlighted, the Proposition EE and the UPK program. We're already utilizing Summit pre-K programming. So how can we, in our efforts that we're already, distributing this programming, work with UPK, work with our SPK and other funding sources, again, to make that cost lower for families?
Thank you. Jeannie brings up a great point here in the chat about the inequities on the north end of the county, versus the South End, just because of the investments that Breck has been able to make. So it is exciting to see a childcare facility coming to Silverthorne. Absolutely. All right, let me make sure I'm getting all of these questions. Oh, here's one. At what age for an infant should you start applying for help in the Early Start programs? What does that process look like?
For early Head Start, we start seeing families during pregnancy. So as soon as a mom is pregnant, we like to talk with them. Early Head Start and Head Start program standards look at the federal poverty level. So income levels significantly low on that, but they have a rolling application process, and I can hand out information of who to contact about those enrollments.
Sounds great. Think that we've gotten to all of our questions in the chat. But I do want to take just 1 minute. The Northwest COG has recently, and I'm going to have to pull it up really quickly, I apologize, but the Northwest COG did just recently release their regional assessment of the childcare industry. And I think that that has a lot of really great content for the folks on the call. So we will share that with you as well as I think we're able to share these slides after the fact as well. So we will be sharing all of that information. We really appreciate you jumping on this call. Catherine, Nicole, thank you so much for your time. I think that this is a really important conversation. You know, traditionally, we have really put the burden of childcare on the employee. And here in Summit County, we know that we cannot continue to do that. And we're so lucky here in Summit County that we do have a community that is willing to invest in early childhood education and to really find ways to help our community in this realm. So it's the start of a conversation. You know, we do have a new childcare facility coming online, we anticipate, down in Silverthorne. We know that there's a number of other opportunities. So I invite everyone on this call to think about what that could look like for your business. And please reach out to me or Catherine or Nicole to further this conversation. Let's look at some potential co-ops in our community. Let's see how we can rethink childcare in a different way that really works better for everyone in our community. So with that, I am not seeing any more questions coming in. Ladies, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
No, Blair, but thank you for mentioning the Northwest Colorado Council of Governments and their report. I read through that this morning and tried to highlight some of the things that they had mentioned on their report in my slides as well. They definitely go in depth a lot more for it. So we'll be excited to share that because that was hot off the presses, I believe yesterday came through. So it's hand in hand here. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today, Blair and Catherine. It's always great to see you as well. And yes, please feel free to reach out with any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. And again, we look forward to continuing this conversation. I am confident that we will have Nicole and Catherine back chatting with us in the future.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.